I also want to thank all of you for coming. It really means a lot to me to see all these friendly faces, a lot of whom, most of whom I know. So thank you so much. And I would like to introduce Erin Donahue, who is, I have known now since 2009. We met in an Osher memoir writing class. And we liked the class so much, several of us in the class, that we kept on going. And we would meet.
And going and going and going.
Mhm. And Erin agreed to step in at the very last minute because Cindy Bittinger from the Historical Society wasn't able to be here, isn't able to be here. So bless you, Erin, a longtime Upper Valley native and therapist also. And I thought I would
Before
start.
Dena starts, can everybody hear Dena
Yes.
in the back row? Okay, good.
Wave your hand
Yeah,
if you
if you-
can't.
Yeah, good.
So I thought I would start by just reading a section from the book. So I'm trying to summarize it so I'm not sitting here reading for hours and hours. So it's Germany, July 3rd, 1937. And that's 1 year before Neville Chamberlain negotiates with Hitler for peace in our time. 2 years before the German army invades Poland. A young woman is at a train station in the city of Mainz. The woman finds the staircase for her connection and ascends the stairs. In 10 minutes, the express train will arrive and she will embark on a journey. Her trunk has already passed Gestapo inspection and was sent ahead. From Ostend, Belgium, she will cross the channel to England, a country she has never seen with a language she does not speak. A job as a nursery governess with an English family awaits her. This is her first trip outside Germany, and she is nervous, but also determined. Her determination outweighs her nervousness. She knows she must leave. The platform is crowded with people and luggage. Families hug relatives in tearful leave-taking. As the woman walks down the platform, a young man approaches. He too has black hair and is of medium height and wears a dark suit, a white handkerchief neatly tucked in his breast pocket. He looks tired, stressed. Only an observant bystander would detect a connection between the man and the dark-haired woman. Their eyes meet, but they do not acknowledge each other. As the man walks past the young woman, his hand raises hers. In the commotion, no one notices the man slipping something into the woman's hand. The woman climbs aboard her train, which has just pulled into the station. Unobserved, she opens her hand to find a small piece of paper containing 3 words and a photograph. The young woman smiles. She has made the right decision. She folds the paper carefully and hides it in her handbag. 1938, 1 year later. The late morning sun shines on the vineyards along the rolling Hessian hills. In a few weeks, the grape harvest will begin. The same young man, carrying a small cardboard suitcase, steps out of his parents' house in Guntersblum, the German village where he was born and where he has lived his entire life. He walks toward the train station, a short distance from his parents' house. His parents and brother-in-law accompany him. The young man doesn't want to leave his parents, the vineyards he tended, his home. But if he doesn't leave now, His American visa will expire. Do not let that happen, colleagues and friends had urged him. There is no future for you here. And so his preparations were hurried, his suitcase hastily packed. His parents accompany him as far as Mainz, where he will change trains and continue alone to Köln. From there, he will fly to London. As they wait for the train, he asks his brother-in-law to look after his parents. Before he can change his mind about leaving, the train arrives, and he and his parents climb aboard. The train takes him away out of Guntersblum, past the vineyards. In Mainz, he says goodbye to his parents and boards another train. He will never forget the sight of their faces as he departs for an uncertain future. Elizabeth Bickel and Emil Rueb, the man with the hastily packed suitcase, were my parents. They were among the fortunate, for they survived. I asked wonderful Megan to help with PowerPoint to show the map. I thought it might be of interest for you to see. So if you can see Frankfurt, it's in that area to the left of Frankfurt, Wiesbaden, Mannheim, where Guntersblum is located. And the next slide, if you don't mind, Megan, yes. So that's the area that my father was from, Guntersblum, and my mother came from Worms, which is not that far away.
Good.
I will turn it over to
Thank
Megan.
you. Thank you, Dena. What, so your parents left separately. Why didn't they had already met. Why didn't they marry in Germany and leave together?
My parents met in 1932, and who came to power in 1933? Adolf Hitler. And by 1935, there were the racial purity laws, which meant that Jews and Aryans, right, could not marry. As a matter of fact, it was very dangerous. My parents had to meet in secret. It was dangerous for them to be seen together. My mother used to work in Jewish homes, and when this law passed, she ended up having to work in hospitals because she was no longer allowed to work in Jewish homes. And at one point, her father received an anonymous letter threatening my mother with concentration camp if she continued seeing my father.
Whoa.
And my mother had enough. She had an opportunity in 1937 to go to England and work as a nanny in an English family. And that was the scene I was just reading when she got on the train to leave, knowing probably 3 words of English.
What was it like for you to read their correspondence that went on 4 years, that kept this love affair going? What was it like for you to read that and really take in how this arc, how many years really passed before they could finally be together?
It was challenging. Reading my father's handwriting got better when he started typing. That was good. I had more of my father's letters actually than my mother's letters. My mother was very private and did not want her letters read. It was challenging, it was interesting, and at times, I will confess, embarrassing. I mean, these were young adults in their 30s and had sexual lives, had sexual interests. And there were moments when I really blushed. And I owe it to my wonderful writing group. Ross is here, Ross McIntyre is here from the group, and I think Fern is also here from the writing group. People in the writing group said, you have to include that, otherwise it's not real. So I selectively included some of that. But mostly it was their love for each other and their yearning for each other, which came out in the letters.
And I think if I have this date right, the U.S. consulate closed in October of 41. How was that tragic for your father?
Well, my father was very fortunate and wise. He did not want to leave Germany. He left in 1938. You had to have an affidavit to get into the United States, and an uncle provided that for him. He left in September of 38. And it was a good thing he did, because if you remember your history, November 1938 was what we call Crystal Night, which was really, I think that's when things really picked up in Germany against Jews. So fortunately, he did leave in 38.
And so it was devastating for his family, who was still there and now couldn't easily get out.
That's correct. And the United States had quotas. We had an immigration policy, but not a refugee policy. So the fact that there were people desperate to get out to save their lives really didn't have any impact in the United States State Department, which was quite an old boy network and quite frankly, anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
So 1941 was really, my Jewish grandparents had applied for visas, but they had very high quota number. And their daughter and her husband, that is really a very sad story, because they had visas, but the consulate wouldn't issue the visa unless they had proof of transportation, proof of ship's passage to the United States. And there was no money to buy the tickets. So the doors were really closed for my father's family.
And how in the world did your father end up in Hanover, New Hampshire, and into photography? And how did photography, as he said, save his life? I know it is saving mine, but I love photography, but how did that happen?
My father loved photography. He always had done it as a hobby. And there's a part in the book where he actually went to London trying to get help from an uncle who refused to help. And so he was really quite down, and he was walking on the street and he saw a photography store, and there were all these large format cameras, the big clunky things. And Germany at the time was known for Leica Kleinbild photography, the 35 millimeter photography. And that was the big thing. You didn't have to lug something around. My father wrote in one of his accounts that he said, I'm not a religious man, but in that moment he realized what he wanted to do was to go back to Germany and learn to be a photographer. So he was a photographer, came to the States, was trying to find work, which was very hard. There were a lot of refugee photographers. And in in some of the photography magazines, the editors wrote to say, there are all these trained German or refugee photographers looking for work, couldn't you offer them a job? This was directed at people outside of New York. And there was a man in Hanover, Philip Carter, he and his brother had started this very small camera store. The brother died, and Philip Carter needed someone who had the kinds of skills my father had to offer. So he went to New York, he interviewed people, and he gave the job to my father. So that's how he got to Hanover. And he didn't want to come. He didn't want to leave his family, his cousins with whom he was staying. He thought he would have more connections in New York. And he arrived in White River Junction in the middle of a snowstorm.
How did he ever talk, I don't know that he ever spoke about this, but how anti-Semitic did Dartmouth feel at that time when he got here?
He said he wrote in one of his letters that this was a town, a very small town, I think about 2,500 people at the time. I don't know if that's accurate, but that's what he wrote. And that most people were not fascists and were not pro-Hitler. So there were very few Jews at the time, but I don't think he felt any anti-Semitism then when he first got there.
Good. And would you speak a little bit about why this book was important for you to write? And part two is why you believe it's important for us to read it. And what you want for us to get from it.
I have been wanting to write this book for a very long time, in part because I stumbled on a box of letters that I didn't know existed, letters from my Jewish grandparents to my father, copies of my father's letters to them. I found letters to my mother, and I just thought, this is a story that needs to be told, and I wanted to tell it.
We're glad you did. And what do you think is important for us as readers? What do you hope we take from this book?
Well, one of the things I hope people will take from the book is some empathy for what it is like to have to leave your home country. I think of the people at our southern border, mainly our southern border, and I think also Canada, but people who are persecuted, people who are trying to save their lives. And my hope is that this story, which took place in the 40s, would give people some empathy for what it's like to have to leave your homeland.
When the U.S. entered the war, what do you think that impact was on your father? And I think you cover some of this in the book. If you want to read
I'm trying to think the part I wanted to read. Yes. This actually won't be about the impact on my father, but I will get to that. But I thought you might enjoy if I read a little section about war preparations in Hanover. And I owe a huge amount of gratitude to this Howe library that happened to have on microfiche, and I think Megan was the one who helped me, the old defunct Hanover Gazette. So I'll just read a little section. War preparations in Hanover, 1942. For Emil, my father, war had begun in 1933 when Hitler assumed power in Germany. For Hanover, New Hampshire, war started on December 7th, 1941, with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The residents of small-town Hanover adapted to the new situation. Town leaders discussed financing local civilian defense and protecting the public. In early January, highway agents provided Hanover households with sand in case an air raid caused a fire. Residents were advised to empty their attics of any combustible material and replace it with, quote, a pail of sand, a shovel, an axe, eye shields, leather gloves, and a snuffer, close quote. In the event an incendiary bomb penetrated the roof, air raid wardens were appointed for each neighborhood with a private home designated an airplane spotting station, and blackout information was circulated. Hanover merchants also adjusted to the war, offering to advise residents on their individual blackout needs. A local store advertised blackout cloth and window shades. Grocery stores informed their customers that wartime conditions required cutting grocery deliveries to 2 per day. Deliveries to your house. Dartmouth shortened the college year by 5 weeks and offered a summer session to speed students through their courses prior to entering the military. War brought some drama to the train station in White River Junction, Vermont, where Emil had arrived from New York in 1939. Near midnight on January 1st, 1942, a local resident posting letters at the station noticed a train pull in that was staffed with Army and Secret Service officers. Everyone had to remain inside the station until the train departed. It was rumored and later confirmed that Prime Minister Winston Churchill was on board, en route from Washington to Canada. Our informant, this is from the Hanover Gazette, tells us that the atmosphere seemed to be full of secrecy and tension, prosaic as this incident may seem to be. So that was the advent of war. But remind me of your question, because I went off.
No, how did your father feel when the U.S. entered the war? And I'm sure pressure with his family, he must have gotten more despondent, that they wouldn't be able to leave, tensions were mounting even more than before.
I think prior to that was when his parents were deported. Now, he didn't know that they were deported, but what happened for him with the advent of the declaration of war was that it made him, he became an enemy alien. And that meant enemy aliens were not allowed to have cameras. And I remember his telling the story thinking, but he's running a camera store.
Yeah.
And one day, two men from the FBI showed up and asked to speak to him. And the local police chief was there too. And he was told that he had to turn in his cameras. Now, he needed the cameras for his livelihood. And eventually this got sorted out, and he was allowed to take pictures, but you could only take pictures indoors. And at Dartmouth, they had, I can't remember the name of the soldiers. Do you know, Ross, is it the V something? Anyway, they had training for soldiers who were going to be deployed in Europe. And usually my father sent an employee from the camera shop to take the photographs. Well, one day the employee couldn't take the photographs. So, and these were important because the soldiers sent them to their families, to their loved ones. So my father went, took the photographs, and then asked to see the commanding officer and explained why he had taken the photographs. And the officer said, "Don't worry, you come anytime and take the photographs." So
Good.
that was
Yeah.
a relief.
Yeah. So while Emil's in Hanover and adjusting to all this, how does your mom end up in the Isle of Man? She's giving you guys sneak previews, by the way. This will all come together when you read the book.
So England was, of course, entered the war before the United States did. And you probably remember or know of Dunkirk. And as things were getting more precarious, England had declared war on Germany in 1939, 3 days after Germany had entered Poland. But it was those months were what they called the phony war, because not much happened until Dunkirk. And that's when the British government thought, ooh, we better take out any Germans, Austrians, Italians, get them out of England, because, it might be a fifth column. They might be planning on overtaking our government. So that's what happened. My mother, one day there was a knock on the door. She was working at that time for a doctor's family in London, and she was told she had to go with the police officers, and ended up on the Isle of Man, where she was interned. She always said it wasn't so bad. They stayed in these lovely hotels that normally served British tourists, but there weren't tourists that year. So she and several other people were on the Isle of Man in Port Erin, which I went to see several years ago, and is a lovely, lovely place. My mother said it wasn't bad. They had enough to eat, but it was just, they were anxious. What was going to happen to them?
Their lives were on hold.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Did your family, your parents ever go back to Germany?
Yes.
And what was that like?
My parents went back to Germany in, I think it was either 1952 or 1953. I was 3. So I don't remember very much. I remember a famous family incident where we were visiting friends in my father's hometown, and they served soup. And I, at home, had seen my father sometimes pick up the bowl. And so I thought that was quite okay, and I picked up the bowl. It's not okay, especially not in this family's house. But that was the first time I went back with them. I think it must have been very hard for my father. And at that time in Germany, people were they were recovering from the war, and they were trying to get their lives back together. So a lot of times people wouldn't even ask my father, what happened to your family? People just didn't want to talk about it then. It's very different now, but that was then.
Did any of their respective families survive?
My father's?
Yeah.
No. No. My grandparents and their daughter and son-in-law, after Crystal Night, November 10th, 1938, their house was so badly damaged. People came in and just smashed everything to bits. They couldn't live there anymore, and they went to Frankfurt, where their daughter and her husband was living. And I've lost my train of thought.
I just wonder if anybody survived.
Yes,
That
no.
couldn't get out.
No,
on their own will.
they did not survive. They were deported November 11th, I think is the date. They were deported from Frankfurt, all four of them, to Minsk in Belarus. And the last letter my father got from them, basically, my grandfather and my grandmother, they were different people. My grandfather just said, when I know our forwarding address, I'll send it to you. My grandmother said, you didn't do enough to help us. And my father lived with that guilt his entire life.
Wow.
I wanted to show a slide, and I forgot it was there, of the Isle of Man. Is that, I think it's the next one.
This one?
Actually, no, but this is my father's village, Gundelsblom, and it's from an old postcard, and I snuck a picture of it. I found it online. This is so you can see the Isle of Man is that little island there. And so all the women that were arrested were put on a train, sent to, I think it was Liverpool, and then from there they took a ferry to the Isle of Man. And from the Isle of Man, they took this little train, narrow gauge railroad. So one of the women in turn called it the little toy train. And they went off to the town of Port Erin on the Isle of Man. And my mother was there from March until January of, I think it was 1942.
Wow. Long time, yeah. So, Dena, you are clearly very loved in this community. And this is an amazing opus. And having read the book, you will all see how she weaves the emotional thread with the logistics, with the correspondence to committees and to departments of state to try to get paperwork going, with her own, Dena's own presence is in the book as well, which I love that you did. You didn't just make it a history book and be back just with them. You're woven through it as well, which I think was the right choice, and it's great. That's beautiful. So we would like, if you have more comments, or does anybody have questions for Dena about this book or this process for her?
And maybe before that, if you don't mind, can you just show the rest of the slides?
Yeah, if you want.
Oh, is that you?
Oh, there you
I thought you would appreciate that, in part because this is Lebanon Street, and the flagpole is the high school flagpole. And you can see my father's carrying an Easter basket. So, he was Jewish, my mother was Lutheran. I had Easter. And in back, immediately in back, I think that's now an athletic field. But there were these, I don't know what you call them, these small apartment buildings that are now long gone. And of course, the trees. I don't think we have those trees anymore. And I think there's one more.
How old are you in this picture, Dena, roughly?
I'm thinking 4, maybe.
So cute.
Oh, yeah.
Is there one more picture?
Yeah,
There. Oh.
And this was, actually Jim Bouchard is here. His mom, told me that she helped my father find the land that they bought and where they built their house and where I live today. And I didn't know that when this picture was taken, but we had gone there and I had to pose, which I hated. And he used the photograph for the Jewish New Year, for Rosh Hashanah cards that he would send. I think, is there one more? Megan, it's not. Yes.
Good. Questions, and if anybody on Zoom has, I want you guys to speak up, yeah.
So my question, Dena, is when you discovered these letters, I take it they were all in German?
Yes,
And
yes.
do you speak fluent German to understand them, or did you have to get them translated?
My German is not fluent, so I read them with the dictionary. But my parents spoke German to me when I was growing up. And we went every few years to see family, my mother's family in Germany, and they didn't speak English.
All
So,
right.
and my mother said the first time we went, when we came back, I went to nursery school, the Hanover Nursery School, which was then in the white church.
Oh, yes.
And my mother said, I didn't want to go because I couldn't remember how to speak English. But it was enough to understand
Thank you.
the letters. Thanks for asking.
In the back.
I have a question. I'm sorry for being late. I'm Jewish, my wife is not. I watched my mother-in-law read your book, just sitting nonstop reading your book. My simple question is a loaded question. She was giving me play-by-play from the election that happened in the town the other night during certain articles, and I'm curious, given a second printing, would you do a prologue between the invitation of this event and now? A lot has happened. Given a second printing, would you do a prologue around this time period in Hanover?
Focusing on Hanover or?
Current state and things that have happened.
Right.
Current political situation,
I don't want to get there, but yes.
but yeah. We were reading between the lines, yes.
And you are thinking about Israel, right?
Yes.
And what's going on in Gaza. And I think the way I'm going to answer that is what I think my father would have said. And I think he would have been completely horrified as to what is happening on both sides. And I probably haven't answered your question, but we'll talk more.
Yeah.
Dena, when, at one point, several years ago, when you were doing this research, I remember that you came to the reference desk here and you were looking for any accounts of how people might have felt as they were making that journey across the Atlantic to a new life. And I certainly was no help in getting that information for you, but I'm wondering, as you've written the book, what you think it might have felt like for your mother. Did she knew that your father was here waiting for her, but how did they get back together, I guess is the question.
So the question was, Dena at some point had come to the Howe to do research about how people felt coming across the Atlantic to a new life in America. And specifically, how would her mom have felt, even though she knew she was going to her loved one's arms, still it was a total change of her life. And what did she go through?
Well, part of what happened was when the war ended, it didn't just happen like that my mother could come to the United States. There were many steps, many back steps, and finally, things came together that she could come. I mean, bureaucracy, planes.
Yeah.
It wasn't very easy. I mean, the war ended, help me out, 1945. 1944, if I have that right. 45, thank you. Thanks, that's right, 1945 in, I think, May 8th. And my mother didn't get here until January of 1946. So it was a long haul.
Yeah.
And very hard and very discouraging
Yeah.
for her.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Dena, growing up, how much did your parents talk to you about what happened, or did they not at all?
Kid, did you hear that in the back? Okay.
Thank you, this is a lovely question.
Oh,
They-
growing up, did her parents, how much did they talk to you about what they went through in the war?
They mostly talked about their story and not what happened to them in Germany and not what happened to my Jewish grandparents.
Yeah.
So I really didn't know all the details. I didn't know, for example, what happened to them on November 10th. I found that in some of the papers that I kind of gathered from my mother's house. They kept that from me.
Dena, tell us about the title.
Oh. The title, All for You. So when my mother left and she and my father passed each other on the train platform, and my father handed her a note. The note said, All for You, and it had a tiny little photo of my father from a contact sheet, if you remember what those things were. And she kept that note her entire life.
Wow. Nice. Anything else? Good? Oh, yes.
I'd like to know, I think you mentioned interviewing your mother after you'd gone through the letters and everything, and I'm wondering how she was during that interview and what maybe you learned that you hadn't learned prior to that.
That's a lovely question.
She's asking if Dena interviewed her mother, what was she like being interviewed? How was she? Yeah.
She, I'm trying to remember. It was a while ago. And after that interview, unfortunately, she had an accident. She was struck by a car. And so, I mean, she survived, but her memory wasn't very good. She was pretty honest, but I will confess, I found a folder of her letters to my father under her mattress. This was after she had this accident and had to go to Mount Scottney for rehab. And I didn't have the time to run somewhere and have them photocopied. And those letters are gone. But I have some of her letters to my father. So I get a sense of what it was like for her. And I know it was, toward the end, it was extremely hard because she wanted so much to be with him. And when there kept these obstacles, one after another kept coming, it was not an easy time for her.
Yes.
Did they have trouble getting mail to each other? I'm trying to imagine this happening today.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a great question. I didn't see reference to that in the letters, but actually the mail going back and forth, it wasn't It wasn't like our mail, which right now isn't so great, to be honest. And sometimes my father would say, I got, two letters at the same time, especially after war broke out.
What was the lag time generally?
It could be, 2 weeks, a month. And the letters were censored. From Germany, someone explained to me that when my grandparents could still write letters, they had to do it from the main post office, and those letters were censored. And I'm not sure all those letters got through. I hope I've answered your question correctly.
Anything else? Any others? Okay.
Thank you so much for coming and for all your support and friendship. And I see so many familiar faces. And I'm very grateful that my father landed in this community. And please eat some of the food, a lot of the food.
And Dena, are they out of the books in the back, or are there still?
I believe they
We are
are.
out of physical copies, but we're happy to order some in. We can have them by very early next week.
Okay,
Thank
good, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.